Don't try to understand this introduction, just feel it. Today we're discussing Tenet, Christopher Nolan's 2020 film, and we're doing something a little nuts. Let's take a notoriously hard to understand and explain film, and let's put 6 people on the same podcast to talk about it. That won't be confusing at all, right? But don't worry, we have a plan. So 3 of us right now are recording the introduction, and 3 of us are recording the conclusion, and we're all going to meet in the middle and do the first Temporal Pincer podcast. More seriously, we discussed Tenet at the OSV offsite, and it seemed interesting, and I'm kind of mixed on it. And on one side, there's the Tenet mafia that loves it, and on the other, a bunch of other people unsure. And so I decided, let's do a rewatch. I invited people, and everybody raised their hand. So that's why we're 6 here. But to keep things a bit organized and not too chaotic, we're going to start with a kind of spoiler-free intro, go around the horn, ask everyone like what they thought of it the first time they saw it. Has this rewatch changed anything? How do they feel about Tenet in general, the good, the bad? But let's try to keep it spoiler-free. After a big spoiler horn, we're going to go into all of the gory details, the plot points, the crazy special effects, the music, the acting, whatever we feel is interesting, we'll go in there. And if we have time at the end, we'll try to rank Tenet in the broader Christopher Nolan universe. I'll begin and give my kind of high-level intro, and then we'll go around the horn here. First, I gotta say that the concept is really cool. Like a film where characters can move forwards and backwards in time. A film is a palindrome. Like the beginning takes place at the same time at the end. You see scenes from multiple... Like this is some of the coolest concepts that I've ever seen. So I have to really, really respect the big swing. And I feel like it's much harder to do this as a film than as a sci-fi book, because there's a bunch of stuff you can write that's very hard to show and have it make sense. Not saying that everything in Tenet makes sense, but it's very hard. So the first time I saw it, to me, that was like Nolan's James Bond or Mission Impossible. And these are not my favorite kinds of films. That's kind of my bias going in. My bias is like my favorite type of stuff is very character-based and dialogue-based and like Deadwood and all that. So a little bit of that was missing for me. My first time, I was kind of mixed on it. This time I did the research. I saw the YouTube explainers. I saw the flow charts and the drawings. And like I looked at everything. I feel like I kind of understand the plot much better now. That really improved my perception of it. I still miss a lot of that character stuff. I feel like the stakes could be higher at various stages of the film, but I like it much better now. But I love it and I dislike it at the same time. It's Schrodinger's film for me. I guess it's appropriate for this film. And I feel like listening to the others, I really want to hear what they have to say, because I feel like it could make me go one way or the other. So that's my starting point, and that's where I am right now with Tenet. Let's go around the horn. Let's start with Jim. And Jim, how many times have you seen this film? Because I heard you on the podcast tell, I think, Rune, that you've seen 4 times, but that was a while ago.
Yeah, no, actually, as I was thinking about it, I renumbered and went back and thought this was actually the 5th time that I've seen the movie. Obviously, spoiler alert for me, I loved this movie. I loved it the first time I saw it because it was in this era of Hollywood remakes of slop and slop and slop, and you know exactly, oh, well, okay, so it's this character, Iron Man must do X, Y, and Z, and you know, this one was, the first time I saw it, I was like Keanu Reeves in Ted and Bill's Excellent Adventure, right? Whoa, whoa. And so I think the reason I loved it the first time and love it more each time I watch it is because it is such an original, high concept movie that basically breaks tons of rules while paying attention to actual theories of physics. In a lot of things, you know, they'll just invent something and it won't be based on any actual theory that the physicists have. Here, his line of consultants in physics was pretty deep. I liked the idea that they were playing with concepts that physicists actually are experimenting with. And look, it's a great spy movie that adds a little sci-fi, that adds the, you know, palindrome nature, as you point out, Liberty. But since we can't do spoilers, I guess I gotta have to shut up.
Soon, very soon.
Yeah, so I love it.
One in the love it camp. Jack, how about you?
What Jim just said is how I feel about almost all Christopher Nolan movies. I really think there's kind of like 2 different ways of judging this, which is against other Christopher Nolan movies and against everything else. And against everything else, this is better than 99.9% of the crap that Hollywood churns out on a regular basis. Maybe 99.99%. Remember, this movie came out during the pandemic. And so I pre-ordered this. I have never not seen a Christopher Nolan movie in the theater if I could. I even saw Dark Knight Rises in Dubai, because I was there in this like startup accelerator a million years ago. So when this didn't really get that pandemic release, I pre-ordered it, was like so excited to see it. I agree with everything Jim said. It's an incredible idea, and it is an incredibly executed movie. It has scenes that are so fucking cool and so well done. Like, we were just all talking about him crashing the 747. And excuses aside, I really think Nolan was just like, I want to crash a 747. Like, it's the only way to do it. Because he's so good at this. He knows that the way to show something, to make something look real, is to really do it, which is why he's so great. Now, the other way of judging this is compared to other Christopher Nolan movies. And I think it struggles with some of the details. There's nothing in the big picture or plot. And it's a confusing movie, but I mean, come on, if you're going to a Christopher Nolan movie, like, be ready to do some thinking. Like Memento, you know, he threw down the gauntlet with Memento. And that's one that you have to pay attention. I love movies you have to pay attention to, where you have to follow every plot line and where they're calling back to things earlier. So it's not the big stuff. I think there's a lot of little stuff that kind of struggles, like almost on a scene by scene, in an individual scenes. You know, this is an A- compared to the rest of Hollywood, but in my personal opinion, and art is very subjective, but you know, I think it's more like a C in the Christopher Nolan realm.
Cool. Thinker thinking. How about you?
Yeah, so I think when I first watched this movie, I just was not in the right state of mind to pay attention to something as convoluted and complex and in needing of solid attention to comprehend. So for quite a while, I kind of wrote this movie off as narrative word salad. I was like, maybe this all fits together. I'd have to sit down and really pay attention to all the threads to sort of, you know, see if they make a nice bow tie in the end. But as I've watched it more and more, I've watched it, I think 4 or 5 times now. I like it more and more the more that I see it. To build off Jack and Jim's points, in order to rate a film, you really have to sort of define, all right, what's the framework for rating the film in order to give it like a fair grade? When you compare it against like the rest of Hollywood and the rest of film and the rest of time travel movies, it's a spectacular accomplishment in terms of a narrative. But if I was going to rate it against other Christopher Nolan films just on the metric of soundtrack, it's like, well, now it's one of the worst movies that Christopher Nolan's done. I pick soundtrack because I think that a lot of Christopher Nolan's movies, I think an underrated aspect of how successful they are has to do with the soundtrack. And you know, I say that because he's not a stranger to some fairly concerning plot holes that get very smoothly paved over by an excellent, excellent soundtrack. And I'd love to dive into maybe 1 or 2 of those later. As for Tenet, yeah, the more that I watch it, especially this latest time last night, I kind of really keyed into my favorite moment of the film and exactly like how that ties into the rest of the film. And I start seeing kind of my favorite scenes turns out to be a bit of a fractal for the rest of the movie. And I'm looking forward to talking about it because, as I said, I'm liking it more and more and more.
Can't wait to come back to the music. And interestingly enough, Hans Zimmer wasn't available because he was doing the music for Dune at the time.
That says a lot.
So there's a different composer than Nolan usually has. But let's keep it moving and let's come back to this after the spoiler horn. Dylan, what about you?
Yeah, so it was my first time seeing it.
A Tenet virgin.
So I'm still processing it. There's an idea of like, you know, ignorance being a tool between the characters. So I kind of felt like I slotted right into that as well. So I was kind of on their level to some degree. I had the opposite of Jack. So I had very low expectations because obviously I hadn't seen it until yesterday. So I'd heard so many good and bad reviews that I kind of didn't know what to make of it. So I really went in. And again, I was talking to Tom Morgan yesterday and he was like, well, you know, you compare Nolan to Nolan, it's not good. And I was like, I just didn't do that beforehand. So I kind of just let it speak to me as if I kind of pretended I never knew who the director was. Yeah, I was kind of trying to understand it, kind of sparked my competitive attitude. I was like, you know, this can't be that complex. So at the beginning, I was trying to work out everything ahead of time. And then gradually I kind of gave it, okay, I'll just work out things in real time as they happen. And then it turned into, okay, I'll figure it out later. I'll just go with the flow for now, even if I don't understand it. So I was going against the current of time in that. And it did fall into that quote. It's like, don't try to understand it, just feel it. And the last third, I kind of was like, all right, I'm just going to get into the flow. I'm going to take it for what it is. I'll worry about specific details or plot twists or even the physics of it later, which I think it's a movie that kind of demands that, because it's very hard to hold the physics and the plot to work out both in real time and keep track of everything in real time. On a first viewing, I think it's a movie that requires multiple viewings for that. But I liked it.
Can you quantify that a bit? Is it like liked it as a lukewarm C or liked it as more? Or?
I often don't trust my impressions of movies in real time, because there's been movies that I thought I really enjoyed and I never think about them again. Or, a year later, I can't remember anything about them. But there's movies like Interstellar was one. I was like, I liked that. And then over time, I haven't even rewatched it, but I've just liked it more and more and more because there's specific scenes and shots and ideas that are sticky and you never shake them. But then there's, movies that I kind of was like, oh, that's pretty good. Like Everything Everywhere All at Once. In the moment, I was like, oh, that's pretty good. Never thought about it again. Now I don't like it. I haven't rewatched it, but I liked it at the time and now I don't, because I know it just didn't stick. And I feel this is one that will. And I'm already thinking about rewatching it, which I rarely am with a movie so quickly.
That's a good way to think about it. I often feel like some films peak in the theater. At the moment I'm watching them is as much as I will ever like them. And then it decays. While some of my favorite films I like more and more of the time. Thank you. It's so cool to have people who have seen it like 5 times and you that have seen it for the first time yesterday. I think that's a nice mix. Ed, what about you?
So I really, really like this movie. So I'm sort of in the middle. So this is the 3rd time I'd seen it. It's funny because actually, Jack mentioned COVID, and actually, I'd forgotten until I was thinking about this podcast how much this was wrapped up with COVID when it first came out, because there were all these narratives around it, like, is Tenet going to be the film that saves cinemas? And then there was all this stuff about should it even be in cinemas? Is it dangerous to go? And it was such a COVID film. And so my first time seeing it was very wrapped up in that. I was a bit of a recluse during COVID, and I was like, well, I'm not going to leave the house to see friends or family, but I'm definitely fucking leaving the house to go see Tenet. So I went to sit in a cinema with a group of mates when it came out. I was just so happy to be back in a cinema. It was the first film I'd seen after COVID. Just from that first opera scene where it's so loud, so bombastic, I was just locked in, critical faculties completely abandoned, pure hype mode. I was just so happy to be there. Walking out the cinema, I was just pure hype mode, yeah, that was fucking sick. And then the people I was with, what are you on about? That was completely incoherent. My wife was I'm never going to watch that again. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then the next day I was like, okay, I've got to go see this again. So I went to see it again in the biggest, loudest cinema I could find on my own. That sort of confirmed that, yeah, it is a deeply flawed movie that I really, really love. So I hadn't seen it since then. So I was interested to see how it was going to hold up when I got home. I was watching it at home for the first time. And yeah, this viewing basically entrenched what I thought before in that, it's a deeply flawed movie that I really love. I was trying to think what I like about it. And I think we all probably agree on what Nolan's best at, which is scale and tone and awe and image making and these complex plots and escalating tension and this big budget clinical auteurism. But he's also pretty shit, I think, at intricate character stuff and complex emotions and nuanced dialogue. He's not very good at it. And this film is just the mode of filmmaking I want him to be in. He basically says fuck character, fuck emotional nuance. I'm just going to build this movie completely around my strengths. It means it's a very lopsided movie. And I think it means if you're not tuned in to the Nolan sensibilities, it's not going to have much for you. For me, it really hits. And actually the flaws of the movie are not I don't care that it's convoluted. I don't care that it's clinical or that there's no emotional stakes. I honestly just don't care about that. I actually think where it's flawed, it's that there are parts of the Nolan playbook that he doesn't do as well as he could do. So it's almost he's playing to his strengths, but sometimes he doesn't deliver on those strengths as well as he can. But I love it. I think it's a great film.
That's very insightful. It's making me reconsider a few of my positions on the film. Let's go into details. Let's hit the spoiler horn and talk some more about the music, the acting, the cinematography, some of the big set pieces and scenes. Very curious what you all think. So all right, we're safe, deep in the spoiler zone.
Sounds like that was part of the soundtrack. Do you take that from the soundtrack?
No, but it could have been. Like, so many horns and Inception. And so we can try to go vaguely in chronological order, if it's even possible with this film, and hit some of the biggest scenes, but don't hesitate to jump in if something stood out about other aspects of it. What about the beginning, the opera house, the key scene, starting right in the action, right? No bullshit. It's like, let's begin at the middle part of a different action film. I'll start with my general opinion about it, and feel free to jump in. But I feel like it's very well shot. The scale is very cool. But for me, the stakes kind of, with everybody asleep in the bench and shots are fired, but you never kind of see the bad guys. You're not sure what they're doing. You never see anybody get hit. Like, am I the only one who felt like it didn't feel as dangerous? Like, it's a cool backdrop to film in the background, but I didn't feel like the danger there.
I'll jump in and say, this is probably my hottest take of the film, is that I think it's the best scene in the movie. I love the opera scene so much. It's like the perfect like encapsulation of like, you're supposed to be overwhelmed the whole film, but later on in the film, you've been so burdened with exposition that you can't help but try and unpack what's going on the screen, analyze it, and get out the sketchboard, and like, you can end up isolating yourself from the movie because you've got so much exposition to try and unpick it with. Whereas I think in the opening scene, because you're just thrown straight in there, you've got no context, you've got no background, it's actually so overwhelming that I found the stakes almost became like a bit clearer, because it's all you've got is like being thrown into the rapids, and all you've got to hang on to is John David Washington's character. You're not supposed to know what's going on other than just following him, what's going through. So I find that really, really effective. And also the geography of it is so clear compared to the final battle, where it's just like a bunch of like kids playing paintball. Everyone's just running around randomly. In like the opera scene, I can still picture in my head like where the different levels of it and where everyone is. So like, even though you don't know what's going on, you can see where it's going on, and it makes the protagonist like really clear to follow through it. Anyway, yeah, so I love that scene.
Yeah, I'd even narrow it down to like the first 30 seconds where you're panning out, camera slowly, you're on the back foot literally, walls descending down, music, very fast cut to the guy in the van, cut back, to build suspense in 30 seconds, and then he executes it like 1 second later when it's immediately broken by the action. I was like, it's just an incredible feat of Hitchcockian levels of cinematic storytelling that he does, like, no dialogue as such, or no dialogue at that point. And it's just so bold to start with suspense before the viewer knows what to care about or where to look. I love that.
What I love about the opening scene is sort of threefold. First off, as far as character development, I think that Nolan's trying to develop characters, absolutely, but develop them almost through physicality. You mentioned the protagonist, who's played by John David Washington. Fun fact, he was in the NFL briefly, and he moves amazingly well. His physicality, at least for me, and especially I noticed it on this rewatch, in that opening scene, just watching him run and the way he acts, essentially his body, his physicality is what inspires you about that character. You can draw lots of inferences about who that guy is just by watching him interact and try to get rid of the bombs and all of that stuff. But it's very, very physical. And then, of course, I have to always check my priors. He's Denzel Washington's son. I love anything Denzel Washington does. And I'm watching this guy and I'm like, who is this? Now, of course, I know now. But the first time I watched it, I was like, who is this guy? And so I think that the character development in the movie is very much through physicality and through the score and through a variety of things like that. The second thing is, I love the way he drops you in media res, right? Like, he doesn't give you any setup. And to me, I remember thinking the first time I watched it, what I love about Nolan is he respects his audience. In other words, he's not like, now you're going to see why this person is going to be key. He shows, he doesn't tell. He doesn't have any of the normal tropes that would allow you to, oh, okay, I know what's going on. In fact, he dares you to try to figure out what's going on. And then the third thing about it is the way he cuts those scenes are just, to me, like, that's what, Ed, you wanting to see it in the cinema, right? Like, yes, right?
Yeah.
It plays very differently on a smaller screen than it plays on a big screen. And so I think that beginning scene is great. And now with hindsight bias, you also realize that this entire movie is about temporal pincer movement, right? And what you understand when you see it for the fifth time is the Russian doll aspect of what Nolan has done with that. When I first saw it, I didn't make that connection. But when you watch it repeatedly, by the way, I think that's the way a lot of science fiction movies go. I don't know about you guys, but my favorite science fiction movies I've watched many, many times. And each time I take something different from the movie. And so I thought it was amazing. I don't know that Ed, it was you, that was your favorite scene. I don't know that it was my favorite scene, but I thought, what a way to open up a movie, like with your siren. Like, holy shit, what is going on?
It definitely gets your attention. I think I agree with everything. I just wish I would have felt a bit more of the danger for the crowd. It felt a bit like the Penguin and the old Batman, right? They put the gas in the vent and everybody kind of gently falls asleep. I get it's fine. It's a different tone. It would have been like bloodier and like maybe not PG-13 or whatever. But I agree that the chaos, the confusion, the right in the middle of the action, that I really like. Jack?
I think that this is like one of the 2 or 3 best scenes in the movie. I love opera. I love opera so much. I love going to the opera. So having that be the set, it worked for me like crazy. And Jim, to what you were saying, just watching it as kind of this well-filmed military operation was just so satisfying. So well executed. And I mean, Nolan, his intros are so good. You know, even the 3rd best Batman has one of the greatest film intros I've ever seen in my life. Let alone Inception, or all of his movies. He throws down the fucking gauntlet. Now, Liberté, I do know what you're saying, which is that, okay, this is a deep cut, but if you've all seen John Carpenter's Village of the Damned from the 90s, it also has a scene where everybody, like this whole town, passes out. There's like some aliens and stuff like that. It reminded me a little bit of that, except in that movie, they wake up, but like a half dozen people have died in crazy ways because it's a horror movie. And so there was this interesting element here, which I don't think was necessarily negative, but where John David Washington is running through the crowd and there's machine gun fire. And you are kind of asking, like, are a bunch of the audience getting slaughtered right now? Like, is, you know, it's sort of unclear, but I kind of liked that though, because it added kind of this creepy context of like, man, like what a horrible way to go, to just think you're about to watch some Vivaldi and then you pass out and then, you know, in this terrorist operation, you just get shot. I will say the intro, it has a little bit of what is my criticism that it kind of shows up later on of, I know it's not supposed to be clear what's going on, and that's sort of the point. You know, it's setting up the mystery. It's not solving the mystery. But it is also a little unclear if there's 2 or 3 different teams working. I don't know if he was trying to make that mysterious. Because in the scene when John David Washington's like in the car, you know, the terrorists have taken over the opera, and then he's in the car, and then the driver turns to him and says, "Oh, the Americans are coming." And so I'm like, wait, but Washington's not the Americans? Not quite sure what to make of that, but overall, I thought the opera scene was freaking awesome. And the part you were talking about is weird. I kind of enjoyed in this sort of horror, almost grotesque way. Also, this is based on a true story, right? Where some people fed knockout gas to an opera and ended up killing a bunch of people, I think.
I haven't heard of that, but now I have to look it up, and I'll put that in the show notes for sure.
I'll Google it off the air.
Take a thinking. Did you not like the soundtrack? I'm still thinking about your soundtrack comment.
Yeah, now we can go into it.
Yeah. Did you not like the soundtrack in this scene?
I mean, compared to all of Nolan's other films, Hans Zimmer is just an utter genius, in my opinion and mind. So I felt like the soundtrack did not stand out at all to me. Like if I try to think about this scene, all I hear is the rat-a-tat-tat of the gunfire and the warm-up of the instruments. And I did love the warm up of the orchestra and how the movie starts exactly when the opera is supposed to start.
And they make it sound kind of backwards too, right?
Yeah, that warm up of all the instruments. It reminds me a lot of when you get the opening logo of
the production companies. Like MGM Lion. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. So that opening of all of those instruments sort of like In that warm up, you can kind of hear parts of the song that is going to come, which I really, really appreciate. And then it just does this complete 180 into gunfire. And it's like, all right, you're not going to get a clean song. You're going to get this sort of scrambled mess. So pay attention.
Anything else about the opera, or do we move on to the torture trains?
One thing about the opera that stood out to me were the little pieces of dialogue, which were just overtly very weird, where it's like, we live in a twilight world. We're all strangers at dusk or something like that. And then the close-up shot of the little red tag on Neil's backpack. I almost wish that Nolan hadn't done the zoom in onto the backpack, which was a very obvious, like, hey, here's a clue. Pay attention to this. Yeah. It's going to come back in a very Hitchcockian kind of way.
It's like that bit in The Dark Knight Rises where it cuts to the ending with Michael Caine in the cafe at like 20 minutes in. And it's like, okay, you clearly just showed me the ending. Like, you just be like, put in capital letters like, this is the ending of the film.
Exactly. And it's like the one very overt, like, hey, I'm offering you a hand and I'm going to hold your hand for one part of this movie. And I kind of wish he hadn't done that, because later on, I spent a lot of time going back and forth near the ending to try and see that red tag, because he doesn't do the same thing later on in the movie. You kind of really have to hunt for it. So I'm sort of two minds, but specifically the weird language, I was like, all right, this has got mad Inception vibe, where sentences are like these magical keys that are supposed to signify something that is functional in the plot or functional for the narrative in the mind of the audience. So those immediately stood out to me. I was like, all right, what kind of Twilight is this?
Quick fact check. So it is based on a true event where Chechen terrorists took a theater and then the Russians pumped it full of knockout gas, killed all the terrorists, but also killed about 130 people from the effects of the gas itself.
Wow.
Eesh. And this was 2003, a little bit after Memento came out. I think Nolan saw that article and was like, interesting.
Put that in the file. Wow, okay. I didn't know that. That's crazy. Speaking of crazy, smooth segue, right? The torture scene in between the trains, which is very, very cinematic. And I have more positive things to say as we go, right? I don't want to sound like the Debbie Downer, but for me, the scene didn't quite work, especially the first time, because the second time it's better because you know who the characters are, right? Who's the protagonist and why he matters. But I remember thinking the first time, like, this scene was almost like, who's that guy again? But I don't know, maybe it played differently for you. I'm curious if it worked better for you guys.
I have to agree. I felt like it was a bit awkward. Thinking about it in retrospect, I feel like his time in the windmill could have been better utilized as like flashbacks of him piecing together how he got into this windmill and remembering. If he was just like way more disoriented from the fact that like he was put into an artificial coma after getting teeth ripped out of his head, and then has this absurdly weird conversation on a boat. And I feel like if we just cut to him being in a windmill and being super confused and then like piecing it together through flashbacks, maybe would have been a bit more effective, because I did feel like this feels like the end of a movie as opposed to like the beginning of a movie. And I also it did not look like this guy had gotten teeth ripped out of his head. I don't think I'd be able to speak that well if someone had ripped some teeth out of me.
They quickly say something like, oh yeah, we reconstructed your mouth while you were out, or like, I'm not sure that works that way, but it doesn't matter, right? It's an action film, but the emotional stakes, I didn't feel them.
The thing that I would add there, though, is if you're a fan of other like spy type movies, right? One of the most consistent things in really good spy things are the legends that operatives work with, right? They literally are great actors because they become whatever their legend is, excluding James Bond, right? He's always Bond. But there was a briefly popular show with Sean Bean, who got his head chopped off in the first season of Game of Thrones. But it was called Legends. And it was really fascinating because each episode, he got a different legend. Each episode, he had to become a completely different person. And one of the things that I kind of took away from that was, because of that background thought, this guy is the ultimate spycraft guy. Like, his teeth get ripped out, like, okay. Again, you know, from the point of view of caring, it's kind of like one of the things about the movie that I really, really like. A favorite emerges, as you watch the movie of the various characters, right? But it's almost like he was sitting there thinking, no, I want this to be an exercise in nonlinear storytelling. I bet he's a huge James Joyce fan. When Joyce's work originally came out, people were just, they couldn't figure it out. I always make that connection, right? Because Joyce now, of course, a master of writing incredible books. But if you go back and read original reviews of Joyce's books, people are like, what the fuck is this? And so essentially, to me at least, it feeds my veneration of him as the director and filmmaker, because he's really experimenting with something that audiences are not immediately familiar with.
And it may be a case of careful what you wish for too, right? Because I'm like, oh, the scene could have had much higher stakes. And then actual scenes of torture, like, I don't know, Cy Tulliver torturing the kids in Deadwood, that's hard to watch. You have anxiety and like you feel bad. And like, maybe the film wouldn't be better for me if I felt really bad for a while and really stressed out. And maybe you just wanted to avoid that and have the more kind of spycraft thing without the huge, like, someone you care about is being tortured and you feel terrible.
I thought the scene was awesome. I loved the aesthetic of the trains going by as kind of this cover for them being tortured. I have a theory, you know, everyone says that this was his James Bond. Nolan has talked quite a lot about how he wants to direct a James Bond movie. And for some crazy reason, the Broccolis don't want to let him do it, which I do not understand.
I think it's because Nolan's too independent. Like the Broccolis run quite a tight ship. They don't like their directors to have too much independence, basically.
This is kind of an anti-James Bond scene. This is more Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, where it's like gritty Russia, like dirty, nasty. It's especially after the opera scene, which sort of is James Bondy. Like you got the knockout gas, it's very tightly controlled, and then all of a sudden you're just, and for better or worse, I could picture myself in that chair with just the, you know, the sounds of the trains going by. Like the sound design is so good. And I would say later on, they point out that the opera thing happened 2 weeks before. To my point earlier about kind of some of the details being a little fuzzy on this. And I'm also not sure how they recovered his body. You know, he took the fake pill.
Oh, I assume that the guys torturing him are actually part of the whole thing. And it's a test. They're part of the test.
Huh.
But maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah. That I don't know. But yeah, the aesthetic of it felt very Cold War in the nastiest way possible. And I really liked that. I thought that that was cool.
The next scene is with the scientists. It looks like a basement of a museum or something, explaining and showing the guns and the bullets and everything. A lot of it doesn't kind of make sense, but it feels really interesting and it looks really good. Like catching the bullets from the table, but you have to have dropped it. Like, still don't know how that works, but it's really cool to see. What is all this? Like the detritus from a coming war. That's like really, really good line. I'm curious what you think of that, like starting to reveal a bit the world of what he's getting into.
There was one line that popped out to me. She explains all this stuff about reverse entropy and a particular type of radiation. And then she says, don't think about it, just feel it. On the first watch, that felt to me like, Christopher Nolan's like paving over a black box. It was a signal to me like, all right, this isn't going to make sense. Just like go with the flow kind of thing. And as I've watched it multiple times since then, I've reversed that opinion. But when I first heard that line, it felt like a legitimate letdown. Now in retrospect, I think it was like more of a character to character, like, hey, this is how you function in this universe, as opposed to like an explicit message to the audience that I just misinterpreted. That's how I read it at first. And I kind of inadvertently wrote off the rest of the movie during that first watch. And again, I wasn't in the best headspace to actually watch Tenet. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. So that felt like an excuse to tune out, which was, you know, in retrospect, my own mistake, but it seemed like such an explicit instruction that I just couldn't ignore.
There's a guy called like Patrick Williams. It's really good. I really rate him. He does like YouTube video essays on movies, and he's got a take where it's like, this is a vibes movie, so it's like Miami Vice or something like that. Exactly what you just said there is like that statement is like a thesis statement for the movement as like, it's all vibes, you can't try and analyze it, you just got to feel it. I think that's sort of true in that, like I definitely think I prefer to experience Tenet than to analyze it. Like I don't really care about those charts, to be honest. Like, but I thought the problem with that take is it's like, if it was a pure vibes movie, then there wouldn't be like 25 minutes of exposition and people explaining you all the mechanics, because otherwise it feels a bit like a teacher giving you loads of homework and then you start doing the homework and the teacher's like, you fucking loser. what are you trying to do that homework for? I think like that ties into one of my biggest problems with the movie is that there's a section here from this scene until they start planning for the airport heist, where it's about 20 minutes of exposition. When they start getting to the airport heist, it gets into like classic Nolan, cross-cutting, dapper men in suits in all these different locations, and like it's cross-cut. It's really interesting and exciting to watch. So that's cool. Like I like that stuff. But there's about 20 minutes before that where it's just a series of like fairly labored John David Washington in a room with one other person. First it's this lady, then it's Michael Caine, then it's there's a few different ones. And it's just like shot, reverse shot, them giving not great dialogue to each other. And I feel like that like really slows the movie down.
I'll be the odd man out here. As you probably all know, I love physics, quantum physics. I love all that stuff. And during that period, I was watching it with my wife, and she's like, this doesn't make any sense. And so me being the pedantic asshole that I am, I stopped the movie. And I'm like, no, this is a Novikov self-consistency principle that is well known in physics. And she's like, come on. So I didn't think of it as vibes. In fact, I had exactly the opposite reaction. I was like, they're actually using theories from real physics here. I thought immediately kind of the block universe eternalism, right? That the past, present, and future all simultaneously exist, and that time is a fourth dimension in four-dimensional space-time that connects to points that are all equally real. The whole thing about Novikov self-consistency, events can't be changed. That's how they get away from the grandfather paradox. They can only be fulfilled, right? I loved it. I loved the way that they explained it visually. Maybe it's just because I'm such a nerd about that stuff and love it that I was just kind of surprised. Wow, they must have actually consulted real physicists.
Yeah, the first time I saw it, I also thought it was a vibe movie, and that's why I liked it least. And now that I've watched it, like seeing the charts and understanding better, that makes me like it way better.
Same. I'm 100% with Jim. I thought the scene was fucking awesome. And I think this movie could have used more scenes like this because they do explain everything. And there's this famous thing how there's no equations in physics outside thermodynamics where time is even like linear time going one direction makes any difference. She gets into this. So also, I love a nerdy explanation. And then this movie kind of turns into a series of elaborate heists in all kinds of sexy locations and stuff like that. I was eating this up, including the part where she explains it. And he's like, I'm not seeing Armageddon here. And then take him into the other room and start showing him the pieces and being like, he's like, what is this? Like, these are fragments from a future war that we're finding coming backwards, which I found to just be a really evocative idea.
That's such a cool concept. You could make like 10 great science fiction stories just based on that line.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I also like the fact that, I'm not quoting properly, but something like, where did this come from? Like, how did you learn all this? And she's like, oh, I don't know. I was just assigned this piece of wall. It has a little bit of like a grad student thing of like, or government researcher thing where she's given a very narrow piece of the pie to go extremely deep in, and clearly doesn't have the security clearance or whatever it is to kind of see the whole picture. She's here to analyze this one part really, really, really deeply. I love science stuff like that. And Jim, to your point, Nolan had the best physicist in the world helping consult on this. Yeah, I kind of wish they had sort of slowed it down at a couple other points to sort of break things down a little bit.
Yeah, there are also two kind of species of exposition in it. There is the physics explanations, which you're kind of gasping for air to get some of those along the way. But then like Ed led with, it's Nolan playing to his strengths. And I think in many ways it's like an FU movie where he just said, I felt he was making fun of his own exposition with respect to the characters. Like, oh, Andre Sader, the billionaire who fled the ancient city that was destroyed by the bomb. And it's like, they just said, I was like, this is like so on the nose that it almost has to be intentional. And even with between the two tracks, I think he's like, oh, I've got so many cool scenes to get to. All right, he needs to kill himself. Fuck it. Let's just do it between two trains. That's so cool. And then we'll just jump on to like something I actually want to film and I'll actually slow down. So then I'd imagine like the physics explanations are just little tidbits of passion that he had and things that he'd been exploring. Like you can tell he spent like, a long time in the wiki for the grandfather paradox, and that's probably like, I need to put that in the movie. But then, like the characterological or plot-based exposition sometimes is like, just get me to the next scene. Which again, I'm like, all right, it's Christopher Nolan. You can take me wherever you want to go. But yeah, some of it's just so on the nose. I was like, that has to be deliberate.
Calling the character protagonist also kind of felt like a fuck
exactly.
you.
So many of those things. Yeah.
The only other thing I'd say about that scene is like, it's one of the most Bondy scenes in the film, in that it's like, okay, Bond's had his first mission, it's gone wrong, he's got back to strength, and then he goes see his quartermaster and gets like kitted out for the mission to come, and the quartermaster that explains what's happening. So I think it's also like, he's like, okay, there's got to be a Q scene in there, but like, oh, well, but let's like put loads of time physics stuff on top of it just to make it more like in line with my peccadillos.
How can you one up Q? Oh, let's give Bond a gun that can catch bullets instead of shoot them.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Does anyone know how, despite everything I say about like, I don't feel like I've got to understand it all, I do want to understand the guns. Those guns sound really useless to me, because doesn't someone have to be standing between the bullets and your gun? Because the bullet's being sucked from the wall.
Everything is predetermined, so that person was going to stand there at the time you held the gun. Like, it may be that, but that's the one where your brain hurts.
One little rabbit hole that like I paused the movie and just sat and thought for, a good 10, 15 minutes is when Kat gets shot by an I know I'm fast forwarding, which maybe doesn't matter for Tenet. When Kat gets shot by an inverted bullet, I paused the movie and I was like, all right, that means there was probably some blood on that bullet that went into the window, and that mark is there before she gets shot, which means some of her blood had to be in that cracked window, but she's not shot yet. I'm thinking about like just the cohesion of all of the atoms in her body and the cells in her body. I'm like, I'm not sure that adds up. Like, I'm not sure that's a perfect bow tie.
So in the same way that at various points of the film, the characters have doubles, basically, right? There are multiple versions of same people acting in different places. There's different versions of our blood, right? That would probably be the explanation. Like, it can be duplicated by the turnstile. But yeah, that's mind-bending shit.
That segues into my favorite scene, which I'll leave to later when Kat dives. But just one last little comment on what Jack said. The scientist, Barbara, or Q in this case, she says, they came with the wall. I was assigned it, like all the material I'm studying here. And when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, the protagonist probably assigned this wall to her and was like, part of being so secretive about it is like, well, I have to maintain the cohesion of my own self, not knowing what I need to teach myself, and I'm going to use Barbara to teach myself what I need to know, because I already know, having been through that this needs to happen. So I need to be super vague about assigning this wall.
That's what Neil says later, right? When he's like, why didn't you tell me? Well, it already happened. And he taught Neil that when he recruits him later, because Neil is probably Max, the son of Kat, and it's like, but we'll get there very quickly. Because if we start going out of order, it's going to be even more of a mess than it already is. After that, I think very abruptly, right? And this is a very Bondian thing, right? It's like there's a cut and you're across the world. Like, doesn't matter how you got there. Mumbai, meeting Neil. I have to say Neil is my MVP of the film.
For sure.
Like, Pattinson is great.
Yeah, Neil is great.
He rocks it.
I have a man crush on him with his hair on the side and everything.
Oh, yeah.
I think he makes the film like, I don't know, 50% better just by his presence. So I want to lay that on the table right there.
Yeah, in the Twilight days, who knew that Robert Pattinson had it in him, man? He's so fucking good.
I was thinking this earlier because there's a wave of like teenage actors like Daniel Radcliffe, Zac Efron, Selena Gomez, him, Elijah Wood, and they all went through the similar arc of like teenage stuff, then going in like really weird indie movies for a bit. But then Pattinson's the only one who's then come out the other side, and he's sort of done a full like horseshoe. He's back to being like a blockbuster star, basically. He's like Batman in this film, but he's still got that like indie edge. He's such a sick actor.
So on Mumbai, the arm dealer bungeeing in and all that. At first, though, I was like, why would some arm dealer know so much about Tenet and about all this? And how can you get to that person from like the metallurgy of a bullet? India is a big country. How do you get the right person? But once you've seen the film and you're like, no, he recruited her. He told her what she needs to know. Okay, now it all makes sense. It's all recursively consistent. But the first time you see it, without knowing that feels rough. I don't know if there's a way of changing the script so that the first time feels good and then the second time even better.
Having watched it 5 times, I actually think that adds to the film, doesn't subtract. Because Nolan has been so meticulous that I can only imagine him like going over every scene, thinking, did anyone give it away in this scene? Did she give it away that she knew him quite well, that she had been recruited by him? Again, watching it for the 5th time, I'm like, no, everyone played it perfectly. So for the first time viewer, going to be really super confusing. But when you know that it's recursive, right, which is one of my favorite things anyway. So there's this strange loop. And he navigates that, in my opinion, really, really well. The protagonist, at the end, we realize, of course, that he is the founder of everything that is going on. And yet, when you have that knowledge and watch, it's really kind of cool that there isn't even a facial expression that, like, I really know you and I really want to tell you.
Well, thinking about it some more, maybe I thought it was a flaw of the film, but maybe it makes sense. Like, they do a home invasion. They come in, they kill some of their guards, and then they're chill, they drink, they chat, and everybody's fine. It's like they're dead bodies all around. And so that seems to be kind of a plot hole, but maybe it's because she's like, okay, well, he had to do that, but like, I don't know.
Sucks for those guys.
Maybe that's part of it.
They're just hired goons.
Yeah, they're red shirts.
Yeah, who cares?
Yeah, and that's also like, that's one of the tropes of, you know, the evil people. They don't care if their henchmen get killed. They're just minions. They'll get other minions.
Another great line. Oh, he's communicating with the future. How do you do that? Anything that goes in the record, emails, text, is communicating with the future. It's like, oh, once you start thinking like that, I'm like, okay, that's 10 more science fiction stories right there. I thought that was a very cool line.
Actually, just a small tangent on that. I remember like 10, 12 years ago when I kind of had this epiphany about the coming AI and, you know, had this sort of like panic about it. And the way that I like immediately resolved that panic was I just got on Google, and instead of searching things, I just started typing messages to the future AI and pressing enter. And I spent like an hour just like talking to the future because I was like, this is going to get logged somewhere and this super powerful AI is going to read it one day. And I need to say some things to this future entity. So, bit off
Oh my
topic.
God. We are definitely kindred spirits because I started doing that in 2015 when it was still called machine learning. I'm like, well, let's communicate with Jim from 2035. Let's see what happens.
We're such nerds. I did the same thing, and I wrote something in my newsletter about how everything we're writing and all that is going all in the training sets, and huge nerds here. Nerd alert.
This is a TENET podcast.
Yeah. Anything else on Mumbai?
I have a positive and a negative to the Mumbai scene. The positive is I loved the scene where they're climbing up the walls.
Batman again.
Watching Nolan do practical effects stuff is just, oh man, it's like better than sex. You know, it's the greatest thing in the world. You know, I mentioned earlier, like, I thought some of the details in this were a little bit, I hate to use the word sloppy in a Christopher Nolan movie, but again, comparing to other Christopher Nolan movies, but the security guards seemed very easy to sneak up on. And, you know, there's also the thing where they're like, all right, we need to get out of here. And so they bungee jump off of it, the word bungee jumpable, which is a word, and kind of just land in the middle of a crowd, you know, sort of nobody really seems to notice or anything like that. And I hate to complain about details, but it's details like that that could have, had they been tightened up just a little bit, could have made it like perfect. Although it's interesting, I had not thought about the fact that she hired goons that she knew were going to get killed in order to do this ruse. Because I had the same thought where I was kind of like, you know, they blast the one dude and then, you know, 5 minutes later they're drinking tea and you're kind of like, man, it sucks for that guy.
You had good life insurance, I'm sure. Yeah, it's also the smallest bungee cords I've ever seen. Like, I don't think the physics of the cords works, but details. Then we move to the UK. We see Michael Caine because, of course, Michael Caine. Meet Kat. There's the restaurant fight scene. There's all this kind of like plot section that we can talk about.
Kat gets the upgrade from classic Nolan dead wife to classic Nolan plot device wife. He's just, yeah, Nolan is incapable of writing women, really. Like, she's so underused in this film, I think. She's such a sick actress, but she's so underused.
I'm going to come back to that comment later.
Yeah, she gets her payoff at the end, but I do think she's underused. But the kitchen fight is, it's sick. I love the kitchen fight.
She's greater. You got me at she's greater, basically, yeah.
And there's little like Sergio Leone, little like guitar licks in the soundtrack when he's like walking through. It's so cool.
Yeah, the hot sauce reference. And
But that was just Denzel. If you close your eyes and listen to that back, it's just Denzel. It's like on a training day. It's like completely.
The Denzel voice comes out a couple of times.
It does.
Near the end, too, he starts to sound like Denzel, and it's so good.
This might be a bit of a hot take, but I agree with what Jim was saying about physical performance and stuff. I don't think John David Washington's got the juice, really. He's good, but I think quite a few of his lines feels like someone having watched a spy film and then going to like Starbucks the next day and trying to deliver the same lines and not really landing them.
Interesting.
A bit of a hot take maybe, but yeah, he doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah, but there's a thing about that too, is like, even with how rushed the suicide scene is, I don't think we're meant to care. I think he's doing something interesting where it's a protagonist you're actually not necessarily rooting for. Like, and it plays into Nolan's problem with character development. It's like, doesn't have a name, that's fine. No backstory, that's part of the plot. We've got nothing to latch on. Emotionless, like doesn't like, smile or look sad ever really. And again, you're kind of playing into he's not really even the important one. His future self is. So this idea of like, is he even the important? Because we're still kind of following him linearly at that point.
My thought about that scene was it was Nolan just going, okay, I've dropped a bunch of really heavy physics shit on you. Now I'm going to give you a classic action scene that you would expect, like all the Bond and other fans out there. I'm going to give you a great one, and this is a sop to you just so you can catch your breath.
Yeah, yeah.
And let me ask a question is, later on, when Washington's introduced to Sator, basically thinks like, are you sleeping with my wife? Why did that fight scene happen? Just because he was getting dinner with Debicki and Sator is just like, well, any dude who's getting dinner with my wife, like.
I guess so. He's probably just watching her all the time. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, because then it's the same goon on the dock when they're walking down. And I was like, hey, that's the same fucker. Why isn't he like rushing up and like beating him up now? And he just like, watches them walk along. And it's like, well, that's a change of attitude from earlier. Yeah.
And my joke the first time or second time I watched it with other people was like, well, I know I never want to get invited to dinner with Sator, man, because the next
Never
dinner
goes well.
scene, he says he's going to slit his throat and put his balls in there because he enjoys watching people die that way. I'm like, wow, you're not a good host, man.
Hospitality is not his forte. I think we can move on to Oslo, the heist, the plane. Oh, and a nice reference. I recently watched a documentary called The Last Leonardo about a painting. Is it by Da Vinci or not? And they tried to authenticate it. And a lot of the film goes into Freeports and what they are and how much art is in there and all of that. Maybe this went into the file with the opera thing, right? At some point, Nolan learned about Freeports. Like, oh, that's interesting. And like made a big scene about it. But this turns into a kind of like mini Ocean's 11 in there. I kind of wish like in the Ocean's 11, the characters were better developed. But this whole thing is really, really cool. The concepts, the locations, the way it's filmed, the suits, the person walking around. Like, I would care if he was getting tortured, right? That's the guy I care about now.
Yeah, the planning of this scene with like the cross-cutting between them, like in all these different places. Like they're on the train, then they're like walking, then there's like the camera going around them when there's the three of them talking about it. Yeah, it's very like Ocean's 11-y, or like Inception-y, I suppose, of like them all planning the heist. It's great.
Yeah.
Shout out Mahir, who I had completely forgot, but actually read, in a weird way, read as the most legit sociopathic CIA guy. When they first meet him and they're, like, oh, this plan is bold. And he's like, so we're going to hijack this plane and then we're going to crash it. And they're like, aren't you going to be a terrorist? And he's like, well, we're not killing anyone, so it barely counts as terrorism. Sator keeps talking about his heart rate, but Mahir looks like he's just like... He's not even stressed even slightly during this whole thing. He may as well be talking about doing a Zoom call with HR or something like that,
That was a good line. Like, you want to crash a plane? Don't be so dramatic. Not from the air.
Well, it's going to be a little dramatic. Yeah.
If you like that actor, I mentioned to you, but I want to mention to the listener too, there's a film from 2019 called Yesterday.
Nolan is one of the best casters in directorial history, too. He knows how to take people who you wouldn't expect for a role, that it turns out that they are absolutely perfect at it. Oppenheimer, I thought, was a key example of this, too, where every cameo, Josh Hartnett, Casey Affleck on, you're like...
Casey Affleck is so good in Oppenheimer.
Yeah, and in a million years, I would never have cast him in that role.
No.
And he's fucking perfect. So this is a strength of Nolan, is finding niche actors and putting them in the perfect role.
The heist is great. It's executed really well. I suppose a criticism of it, I suppose this is a bigger criticism of the first half of the movie, which is the part that makes you think maybe Nolan slightly overplays his hand to a certain extent, is that the stakes of the heist actually like aren't really timey-wimey at all at this stage. It's actually a pretty conventional Bond thing of like, this is their way to get to the ultra villain. So they're using Cat to get to the big baddie, which is a very Bond thing to do. The way that is done in terms of there's this picture that is staged there and they need to get the picture by, it gets quite convoluted and it's actually like as confusing as some of the time stuff. It feels unnecessarily confusing in a way that the later parts of the film aren't. And I feel like if it was simplified a bit, then like you wouldn't be as overwhelmed by all the other confusing physical stuff on top of that. Does that make sense?
It does feel a bit like Nolan's starting point was, I want to film something in a free port. Why would they go there? Okay, there's art in there. So, okay, it's about a Goya. Why won't they look at, okay, there's going to be gold bars. Like, it feels like everything is retrofitted to make it happen there. And the plane, considering how much gold there is in it, is very lightly guarded. But all of that doesn't matter too much, I guess. It's like there's lockpicking, there's halide gas, all the cool stuff is there.
The scene was a little bit Mission Impossible-y in that I love the Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movies. Other movies that I will see in the theater every single time they come out on the biggest screen I possibly can. But those have a little bit of, we need to go to this place to do this awesome heist for a thing. No criticism. They literally write those movies that way, where they come up with a bunch of locations and awesome heists and then sort of write the script as they go along. Jim, you've seen this movie 5 times. Like, the plot does completely work out. Like, the reason they go there is to propel the plot forward. But in the moment, you know, you kind of get a little bit of like, wait, what are they looking for again? Like, it's...
And it doesn't need to be that complicated.
Yeah, and it's... the facts are there, but it's a little difficult to remember.
My problem with it is my own baggage that I bring to this, because as Liberty knows, I'm working on a story called The Trust, which involves stolen art that the Nazis stole. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, maybe I should put it in a free port. That's how. So I was watching it from a completely different point of view for the first
crashed
time.
2 planes.
Exactly. Exactly.
Not a 747, a 787. Bigger and badder.
Me and Ed will steal that plane for you.
Excellent.
We already have.
Yeah, it's coming back in time right now in a cargo ship.
I'll bring the helicopter.
So this part of the film gets to another of the big highlights conceptually and visually of the film for me is the turnstiles. They're such a cool concept. The way he did them visually, where you see like the proving window, and like later on there's a proving window on the ground and the ceiling, but on the side this time, that's such a cool concept. And that's such a cool visual concept. I think that's very well executed. I don't know, it takes everything to a whole new level for me once that's introduced.
I loved the detail of you have to see yourself in the proving window because otherwise you're not coming out, which implies this whole world of this has clearly happened before, where people go in and who knows what happened. They have a heart attack, or it's like the fly and they get turned inside out, or... You know, there's no details about what horrific things have happened to people who didn't see themselves, but they learned the hard way. Yeah, you got to see yourself in that window. Otherwise, you really should not go in there.
It's also like a pretty consistent device, right? The portal. It's used in a bunch of sci-fi. If you're a fan of Stargate, you're getting the same thing there. Dark Matter, which was a book that I loved, that Apple turned into a series. The portals do a lot of heavy lifting. And your point, Jack, you got to see yourself coming out. I love that touch. That implies that there are a lot of other people who went in and we didn't see them coming out. So
my thought was sort of the inverse, where I was like, if I see myself going in, and I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to hang back and see if I pop out of this thing.
But if you decide that, it won't have happened. You can't fool yourself.
When a portal is just a window in space-time, And if you can see the other portal and you like stick your hand through, it immediately pops out, that sort of thing. Like that makes a lot of sense where it's like, I can't trick this thing. If I see myself go in there and then like the door closes, it's like, well, what if I just hang back and like wait a little bit? Like, does this thing have like a time delay that will account for my rebelliousness here? So it also kind of reminds me of Donnie Darko a little bit, where he has like that sort of liquid orb thing that goes out from his chest, and then he just like follows it blindly in a kind of zombie-esque way. And I remember way back when I first saw that movie, I was like, take a right instead of a left and just see what happens. Will it like stretch and reconfigure the way that like Google Maps does when you take a wrong turn or something? Like, so that's where my mind went, a bit of a tangent, but I'm always trying to like test how tightly the bow is tied on all of these little aspects of a, for better word, a convoluted narrative.
At the bottom of your question is, what universe is this film set in? Is everything predetermined? Has everything already happened and you're on rails, right? So you can't change your mind. If you see it on one side, it means it's going to happen on the other. Or do people have free will? And like in the way that when he talks to Neil and like, oh, why didn't you tell me? Well, it already happened, and you never know if I tell you something, it could have changed something, right? But if the universe is predetermined, it can't change something. You will always make the decision that leads you to that place, right? But that's also mind-bending.
That question gets to the heart of the movie. Like, what does the word tenet mean? Well, tenet is a principle or a belief. You know, it goes to that conversation that he has with Seder where he's yelling at him and he's like, you don't have any beliefs. And he's like, well, maybe I'm a god kind of thing. To juxtapose that, Neil has a belief in like, all right, we live in a deterministic world. I have to fulfill my role in order for this to work. And so I think your question really like pinpoints on the actual title of the film. Belief, if you go to like the Proto-Indo-European root of it, it just means to care about something, to be passionate about something. So in this sense, like the protagonist and Neil, they really care about, you know, humanity and like the fabric of the current reality that they're in, and they're not going to go against that.
Yeah, well, the beginning of the film is him showing he's ready to die for his mission, right? That's his belief right there.
Yeah. I was just going to ask whether you guys, when you watched it for the first time, did you clock straight away that that would be John David Washington coming through the turnstile? Or were you surprised when it was revealed later on?
I don't think
I didn't
so.
clock it.
I had a feeling that he was going to meet himself at some point or something, but I don't think at that point I got it.
And that's the challenge of, I literally overwrite my memories of what I thought the first time. Because watching it the fifth time, like I know.
Yeah, so, oh yeah, obviously that's him.
Yeah, immediately you fool yourself and say, well, I knew that then. If you keep
that was obvious.
If you keep journals for 45 years, you are disabused of that notion very, very quickly.
I'm going to say no, because he tries to shoot himself in the head a couple of times. Backwards him, you know, they're struggling in the proving room.
The explanation I've seen for that is the second him in the gear knows. So he's trying to empty the gun so the other one doesn't get it and shoot him. And that's why he disassembles the gun at the end. And he's trying to... And if you look closely, it's shot in an ambiguous way to make you think that he's trying to shoot him. But when he fires, he's pretty far off. So that's the explanation I've seen, where you can read it one way the first time, but when you know he's actually trying to empty the gun because the other doesn't know it yet, and that would be dangerous.
Nolan does give us a pretty strong clue in this sequence when the protagonist and Neil start to wrestle, and Neil throws him down a corridor that you can't see. And you see this expression of like...
And he has the mask in his hands, right?
Yeah, and then he throws him the mask and he takes off. And I remember when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's it. That's like another like red tag clue that's going on. It was pretty fast and subtle, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, the first time you know it, but you kind of forget it by the time it comes again.
The look of the portals was so good too. In a world where we've seen a million portals and a million Marvel movies and Stargate, I mean, Stargate did it best, of course. He went for something completely different and also completely practical.
Analog, right?
Proving like you don't need CGI and all this stuff to make something that really vibes as good science fiction.
It reminded me of Kubrick in 2001, right? He built all of those incredible sets.
Even the space station that rotates, and so he looks like he's...
Exactly.
Amazing, amazing sets.
It ties into kind of a real mythology with all those weird Soviet secret histories and their secret inventions. So you're kind of like, this could have happened and we just don't know. So as opposed to it just looking super high tech and being future based, it's like, oh, maybe it's already here. And even like the slight delay it takes when it's turning just adds a little bit of extra drama and suspense to it. It's not just someone stepping through. You're kind of like trying to peek around to see who's there. No, I thought it was awesome.
Speaking of the mythology of the film, there's a real artifact from Pompeii, which is the Satyr Square, which it's a bunch of words that read the same in every direction. And there's opera in there, there's satyr. So that was found in Pompeii. And there's a scene in Italy where Max says he's visiting Pompeii. And you're like, are they traveling back in time that far off that they are the ones who planted this?
Oh, interesting.
It doesn't quite make sense, but I think he was making a connection there. And when he was looking for all these names, clearly in his research, he was reading this book on Pompeii or something. Oh, satyr, that's an interesting one.
Interesting. That's cool.
So I just looked up the Satyr Square. Do you realize that it says TENET through the middle?
I didn't remember that, but that's where he got it.
It says TENET, and it also says opera, and it says Arepo, which is Kat's...
the Goya forger painter guy.
Oh, very cool.
The only one that I can't make... It says Rotas, which is satyr backwards.
Rotas is also the name of one of the free ports or something, some company somewhere.
I think it's his company, is it? Or maybe not. But yeah, there's definitely rotas in there in the film.
Okay, so the Satyr Square is basically like a template for this movie.
Yeah.
It has everything.
I think the next big one is Italy, right? As mentioned, they're on the yacht. There's the dinner scene. Satyr is being a real evil bad guy. A bit of a caricature, but...
So much ham, like hog roast levels of ham from Kenneth Branagh. It's ridiculous, but entertaining. I enjoy it.
I've been to a lot of those places where they shoot scenes. And so, for example, when they're high up with all the busts, I've been there many, many times. But it's in a very different part of Italy than the next scene. But it did work. It was like seamless.
Oh, I didn't notice.
If you hadn't been there, yeah.
I really, really like this part of the movie because it's like, it's got so big and it actually for about 15 minutes, it like contracts right down. It's still in this like incredible, beautiful, big sweeping Italian location, but like the stakes actually suddenly get quite a bit smaller where it's like John David Washington needs the baddie alive, Cat wants him dead. And also the baddie, I think he's most effective during this bit because he's just like a really bitter, nasty man. Whereas like later on when it gets into like the world ending domination mode, it gets a bit eye rolling. For this 15 minutes, I think it's just really... It gets so much smaller, it gets so much more precise for a little bit, and I think it's like, it breaks up the airport heist from what's coming really well. This is the biggest, like, Christopher Nolan just being like, fuck you to the viewer in like a good way, is the exposition scene when they're on the yachts, when they're like, yeah, let's just get on these yachts. And they're like delivering like key dialogue.
Sailboating, yeah.
On the sailboats, yeah, key dialogue. You can't hear a word of it. Like, they're not just chatting like, oh, the weather's nice. It's like specific, important plot information. Yeah. She like randomly decides to kill him, and then it's just like, it's so...
Why is he drowning? Like, he has a vest and he's just facing down in the water. That doesn't make sense. Like, the sailboats I would cut from the film if I was tidying up, but it is very Nolan. It's very like...
That's another Nolan. It's like, yada, yada, yada. Let's get on to the next bit of the plot.
Let's talk about plutonium and racing sailboats.
Yeah, it's famous for having Tom Hardy give tons of dialogue that are completely unintelligible in Dunkirk. You know, Kenneth Branagh, I had a little bit of a journey with him because the first time I saw this, I cannot remember why, but I really thought he was miscast. And watching it this time, I loved him. I thought he was really good. So I didn't write a journal like Jim does. For some reason, the first time I saw this, I was like, why get Kenneth Branagh to play a Russian guy? Like, he doesn't really seem like the type for this. I like Kenneth Branagh a lot, but he can be a little hit or miss. For some reason, maybe it was the balls in the throat scene or something like that. But it landed for me, and I was kind of like, oh. You know, actually, part of it was the end at the yacht when future wife Debicki comes, and you see that he genuinely is happy to see her. There's something about that moment where you're like, it's not just this evil guy. Like, there is a layered personality in here, fucked up beyond all belief, and of course, just like incredibly narcissistic and wants to kill the world and all this, you know. I don't know. I don't know why I made that switch, but he is much more than a Bond villain, which I appreciate.
I enjoyed him, but I thought he was very much in like Bond villain mode, going like full hand performance, like over the top, and like I was okay with that. I didn't need anything more from him for what the movie was, if that makes sense.
I didn't have a problem with his performance. It was the character more where I was like, why does he want to end the world? permanently. It's like he didn't seem mad enough or evil. Like they seem to be in the straddling this middle ground. And they try to shove in a god complex at the end. That was nowhere to be seen beforehand. He just looked like a psychopath mobster. So like he didn't have a full like Macbeth descent into madness or like. So I just didn't believe it. It's like, why do you want to end the world?
Yeah, he seems to care about his son, right? If he had nothing to care for and he was dying and you're like, okay, I'm taking you all with me. But he seemed to care enough about his son and then giving, or I don't know if it was just a pawn to keep away from his wife and control her and he doesn't care, but it would be a bit weird to kill his son.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't understand his point of view. Whereas I could with the Joker in The Dark Knight. You're kind of like, okay, I kind of get it. Yeah. Even though he's way crazier. Maybe it's because he's way crazier, but I just didn't understand.
Well, he has that great line where he's like, you know, my greatest sin was bringing my son into a world that was going to die, something like that. But then you're also like, well, but you can prevent this. You're the one doing this, you know? So it agreed that motivation's a little confusing.
That's why I think he's at his best in this sequence, because the big world ending stuff hasn't really come into it as much. And it's more like he's just like a really jealous, bitter mobster, basically. He's pissed off that this guy's flirting with his wife and wants to hurt him. Like that works. So like that's enough as a villain.
Agreed. If we're talking characters and relationships, the one that is not quite there for me, the film still works, but it would work even better if the protagonist and Kat had better chemistry, because he's doing so much for her and he's ready to die and he's ready to give information and like he's ready to do all kinds of things for her. And we know it's super important because she's the mother of Neil and it's all connected, right? But at the time he doesn't know that yet. And I don't feel they have like great chemistry.
She's the mother of Neil?
That's my understanding. Maximilian, if you take the last part of his name, that's the letters for Neil.
I heard someone say that Pattinson's the only person who dyed his hair and he dyed it to match hers. And he puts on a different English accent than the one that he has to match hers. It still could be a stretch. I don't know. That could be just Reddit brain stuff, but yeah, I don't know.
I think there's too much in it for that not to be the case, but...
Does Pattinson know that? I had heard that because he's really caring with her when she's ill, isn't she? He like sits by her side and holds her hand. Does his character know that she's his mum?
If he's come back to do this, he would have too. And I understand why he's caring so much for her and he's helping her. I just don't understand why the protagonist is like, he meets her and they have really wooden dialogue. People try to kill him and now he's like going to throw his whole life away just to protect her at all costs. And that would feel better to me if they had great chemistry, like either romantic or just as friends or as peers or as something. Here it feels like he meets her for the first time because he wants to get somewhere. He doesn't care about her at first, but after that, every decision is about her.
Yeah.
It also plays with our linear notion of time really well, in my opinion. I love the fact that he's her son because time is navigatable. If we're sitting in 2022, you go forward to 2055, grab the son, get him involved, and it jars the way that we have entrained ourselves to think about time as an arrow.
Yeah, if Max is Neil, then the protagonist and him are doing a temporal pincer on the whole plot.
Exactly.
They switch a few times, but the whole movie from like, I don't know, 20 years in the future to the first frame is a big temporal pincer.
It's a palindrome with the pair of them.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's why I said when we started talking about it, my big takeaway is what he was doing is a little bit like Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, which the movie kind of sucked, but the book was amazing. It takes a lot of artistry to be able to balance all of those things out and work it the way he did. That ending scene where it all becomes clear, right? Like, you haven't figured this out yet?
Let's keep the ending for the ending, but I have so many feelings about the ending.
My only comment on this is I think it would have made more sense had John David Washington and Debicki like slept together. I do wonder if that was in an earlier version of the plot, because there is the scene where he's, you know, holding the gun to his wife later on in the proving room and ends up shooting her through the side. It's well done, but you do have this thing of you're like, John David Washington, he's sort of treating her like it's his wife, but you're like, well, he's going to shoot his own wife. Like they've
met like 3 times before, right? Spent an hour together.
Yeah,
maybe.
And it wasn't like horrible. And, you know, John David Washington's a good person. That's also clear here. And he has affection for her. But yeah, and just kind of movie making, it might have been a little bit stronger had they had something concrete. You know, not that I'm saying you throw a sex scene in, although I mean, why not? You know, but something to kind of just like strengthen that relationship a little bit.
Agreed.
Yeah, since it seems like the protagonist is so unwaveringly mission oriented, It just seems like, in terms of the motivation of the character, like an orthogonal turn here, where he's like suddenly caring so much about her that he's going to take a 2-week detour on this incredibly complicated task of shipping himself in a shipping container to get to this like free port that's already like a nightmare that he's made it in order to get her to this machine. It's just like, they show other turnstiles later on when they put all the soldiers through. Like, did no one know about those turnstiles? It could have made it like way easier to do this. So,
yeah. But it also plays with our notion of time, right? Like 2 weeks is meaningless. It doesn't matter how long it takes him to get there because he can move around freely through time segments, right?
Fair, but it is kind of expensive way to buy yourself 2 weeks because you got to breathe specific air and you got to like imprison yourself in a shipping container. So, yeah. I mean, it all supports what Jack and Liberty are saying is like, I'm not sure this is the best casting. And I think maybe 2 other actors could have made the emotions and the motivations here sing just a slightly sweeter note without some kind of sex scene. I just don't think that these 2 actors kind of pull off this bending of motivation.
Yeah, I think I've got like 2 thoughts on that. One where it's like, Nolan's just not good at this sort of stuff. He's just not good at romance. Like, has he got 2 kids? I think Christopher Nolan has had sex twice in his life. But like, do you know what I mean? Like it's just not.
That's the title of the podcast.
You nailed it, Dad. There it is.
You know, that also explains why he's been so prolific. Like, he's got plenty of time.
Exactly.
Undistracted.
He's not distracted.
Like, so it's just like, it's not his vibe. And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the movie, where it's like, so that's why, because this film isn't about that, I don't mind it too much. I'm happy to sort of wave over it. It doesn't bother me. Whereas other films where he's tried to bring in this emotional art more clearly, I don't think land the plane, because when the film is orientated around the emotion in the same way, like, it doesn't land. The core emotional relationship about the film really is the protagonist and Robert Pattinson, and I feel like that actually works better. I feel like that's quite effective.
Actually, now that I think about it, it is like a spy movie trope for an incredibly dedicated, mission-oriented guy to suddenly just go off script for a woman, regardless of how close he is to her. So maybe Nolan's throwing stones in that direction.
This is the language nerd in me, but I think my favorite scene in the movie was, you know, him holding his wife, the gun to his wife, where they do the whole conversation forward and then it shows the whole thing backwards and you realize it works both ways perfectly. You should realize, but you don't realize that, of course, Kenneth Branagh is doing this conversation backwards. You know, we're literally like the order of the sentences works both ways. I loved that so much.
He actually learned it phonetically backwards. He said it in real time backwards. He had the cue cards, apparently.
I need to go read the script now. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, because when you see it, you kind of know it. But in the moment, I didn't have time to think about like everything he said works both ways and how does it all make sense, right? I just kind of more feel what's going on screen. But now I want to go to the script and actually read and see how it all works together as a palindrome conversation. The next big one, and that's one of the big ones, is the highway heist, the fire trucks, the backward cars chase, the SUVs, the throwing the cases, all of that. Curious what you guys think about this one. This is the most James Cameron scene of the film to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't really have any nuanced opinions on the scene other than just like, it's just pretty sick. Do you know what I mean?
It's like 6-year-old me. I'm like,
yeah,
awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Like, obviously some of the visuals are extremely cool with the reversing car. Some of the little details are actually almost more cool, like with the sort of the wing mirror where you see like the...
Yeah, I noticed it this time.
Yeah. And then when he goes back through the turnstile and like the water's like sucking up into his foot and stuff. And so like, yeah, visually great. As Dylan said, it was just like 6-year-old me was like, yeah, let's do this.
Yeah. I immediately thought of the highway scene in Matrix 2, right?
Hell yeah.
It's just for the 6-year-old in all of us. It's just so much fun.
Big fire truck go boom. You're like, yeah, this is awesome. But it was such a cool little idea that they had to do that to keep it moving so that people tracking the car wouldn't notice anything wrong. So that it was like still moving forward, even though they had a cap. All those kind of little things that are, you don't understand straight away, but it's fed to you with little snippets. I think it's awesome.
I loved the backwards sound design. When he steps out the door, the first moment of we're living the backwards life, you're just getting like the backwards bird noises and everything. It's so like uncanny valley creepy. I just loved that.
I don't know if I'm the only one, but when they, after the turnstile and they come out with the oxygen mask, am I the only one who got Dennis Hopper in Blue Velvet?
Yeah, for sure.
Big time.
Well, I wonder, because the backwards talking is so Twin Peaks, maybe Nolan was like throwing a couple of different David Lynch references in there.
This scene, specifically the moment that you referenced, Jack, it made me realize something about the whole movie, which is that, okay, the bird is going backwards, you see the ship going backwards, and this is like the first time where we're getting an inverted time perspective. And I asked myself, like, what could you do to make this even more evocative? And it made me realize something about the whole movie. Whenever there's time stuff, it's always filmed at the same time of day. Only the dinner is at night kind of thing. But all of the time stuff is like, nothing is close to sunrise or sunset. Because my thought was like, man, it'd be really cool if this car chase had happened at sunset. So when they get to the turnstile, it's dark. And then when he comes out of the turnstile to re-engage with the car,
It's like a sunrise.
yeah, it had been a reverse sunset. But then it made me realize, like, all right, if you were actually going to film that, a sunset in reverse does not look like a sunrise.
It would be so fucking hard to film
Oh, yeah.
without faking the light.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
That would be awesome.
It would be so hard to do. And I was like, well, okay, that might explain why so much of this seems to take place at like the same nondescript lighting time of day, where it's like it could be 11:30 or 1:30. I'm just not sure, you know? There's like that big time window where it's like, all right, we got plenty of time to work with. We don't really have to worry about like the sun setting and how that affects the time thing.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. It sort of makes sense as well, because Nolan is quite clinical. So it's a bit like how his like dream logic in Inception, these huge big skyscrapers like very neatly folding in on each other. It wasn't like David Lynch. It was like very sort of clean and practical and like clean lines. This was like that version of that for time, where like he wasn't as interested in like the crazy visuals of a reverse sunset or something as he was the more like practical implications of it.
Once you commit to the concept, there are so many problem-solving things that you need to do, right? And one of my favorite things in the reverse world is when he gets in the car and driving dynamics are all screwed up. You see him try to drive, and it feels like he's going backwards, but he's going forward for his time. But from the other perspective, he's backwards, right? Just figuring that out and making it look interesting and kind of real on screen must have been like, I don't even know how you go about that.
I also think it's funny that, you know, in this world where CGI is everywhere to what I consider a largely negative effect. I'm not anti-CGI, but I'm anti-bad-looking CGI. You know, the worst of the Marvels where they're just, you know, shooting goo out of their hands and portals in the sky and stuff like that. That he just reversed footage. It looks cooler and more evocative than almost anything else, you know? It's not the amount of money, it's having the eye and knowing how to do it. Like watching the boat wakes in reverse was really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. There is that moment when they're in the very cool, I think one's green and one's red, and like they're having the interrogation. There is that sense of when he goes through the turnstile of that. I just love in movies, that moment where it's like, you feel like everything has turned on its head. He's then going back through time and you're so disorientated, and those soldiers come in from the future. The stakes have been set up, but it's like, everything's flipped. I don't know. I don't really have anything coherent to say about it. It's just such a cool sensation when that happens in films.
If we go back to another cool reverse one, is when they go back to the Oslo Freeport and he's fighting himself, and now you know that he's the guy in the mask.
Exactly.
And the physics of the fight, like that hurts my brain.
That image of him crawling along his back to get the gun, which looks so weird. It looks like something from like The Exorcist or something when you see it, because it's so like spidery the way he's like,
There's the Oppenheimer reference that I got where he talks about like, he was probably like reading the K. Bird American Prometheus biography at the time he was writing Tenet. Yeah,
apparently he started writing Oppenheimer because Robert Pattinson gave him that book after this film at like the shooting party for this film. Yeah, Robert Pattinson was like, oh yeah, we mentioned this in the film, so here's a copy of American Prometheus as like his leaving gift to Nolan. Then Nolan read it, and obviously, yeah.
Very cool. We are getting to the end
So now we have to pack everything into 3 minutes. Exactly. The film. Yeah.
Now it's the classic Return of the Jedi ending where they're switching between like the boat in Vietnam, the pincer from 2 angles. They're going back and forth between all these things. We're the splinter unit. There's all these little cool things in there. I'm curious, how did that ending work for you guys? We'll get to the ending where Neil is making us cry right after, but the battle going into direction, the pincer. What do you think of that?
Can I just fast forward to my favorite moment of the film for a moment?
Yep.
It's when Kat dives off the boat for the second time. Just those couple of seconds when she looks at herself, who is arriving on the boat and looking up at her. The first time we encounter that scene, Kat's interpretation of what's going on is like, oh, that's one of my husband's hussies who's just like scurrying away like a cockroach as the legitimate female of the dynamic comes back. You know, her emotions towards that individual, that entity, are rage and jealousy and anger. And then when we revisit it again, Kate has essentially triumphed over all of the issues and problems that previous Kate, who is looking at her with like such negative feelings. There's so many emotions that she could feel while looking at her past self, where she's like, man, that version of me hates me and thinks I'm a monster. But we'll understand when she gets to this high place where I'm standing and realize like how much I've done for this woman. Then she dives off and you get this figurative and visual completion of her character arc, where she's completed what she needs to do. And in terms of like how this is sort of, in my mind, loosely a fractal for the whole movie, when they introduce TENET, they have this gesture of the intertwining hands. And then when they talk about how the past and the future kind of relate, Neil says at some point in the script, they're basically doing a rehash of the car chase and the explosion at the end. And Neil says, because the environment's entropy flows in our direction, we dominate. They're always swimming upstream. It's what saved your life. The inverted explosion was pushing against the environment. And then the protagonist says, oh, we're like pissing in the wind. And here you have these two versions of Kate, which are very similarly, like in terms of emotion, pushing against each other. For me, it's kind of that microcosm where it happens all the time in real life, where you're replaying a conversation in your head and you think of that perfect thing that you should have, could have, would have said, but didn't think of until later. And you're like, oh, I wish that past version of me had been as smart and as quick as current me is, because then I could, you know, go back and do that. Whereas like Kate actually gets to sort of experience doing that and regretting at the same time. Ed, you talked about how her character was kind of underdeveloped, and I felt like a lot happened in like these couple of seconds, you know, between her pulling the trigger and hitting the water. Just like so much character development happens with almost no words, which is pretty great because it's so laden and layered with context because of her past self getting a glimpse of her. So yeah, that was my favorite scene. I could go on about it, but I'd love to hear what anyone and everyone else thinks about it.
And maybe my favorite scene now too. Great riff.
Thank you.
To the battle scene, I think it raised questions, but also I just kind of fucking loved it. Like the building exploding twice. Yeah. All the Twitter guys have seen me post that so many times because it's like, in terms of just practical effects, shots, it's one of my favorite of all time.
Yeah, it's the most striking image in the film.
It's
for sure.
So good. It's so good.
Yeah.
You know, obviously this came on the heels of Dunkirk, which is one of the great modern war movies. And so seeing some of the Dunkirk stuff done in reverse, the cars driving in reverse with the bombs exploding backwards and stuff, you know, and I said it raises questions. It literally raises, this isn't something where I'm like, oh, there's plot holes. Like, you know, the temporal pincer, and you're thinking about two armies attacking where one goes reverse and then can give the intel to the other that then comes the right direction. He just 10x's the mind bending, and I'm so here for it. I can't say that it was the tightest scene in the movie, but it was incredibly enjoyable for me.
Yeah. Again, first time yesterday, I was like, who the hell are they fighting? It looked like a national military. And I was like, you know, Ukraine or Russia got involved there. And then I Googled it, and like the first Reddit is like, who the heck were they fighting at the end of the battle scene? So I didn't get that in real time, but it makes sense in hindsight. I think they could have been like distinguished kind of visually, because even the enemies and allies were kind of blending together everywhere as well. Maybe that's kind of the point, but for me, it was confusing.
This is my like third big problem with the movie is that personally, I just don't think this set piece works. Like, I agree that there's some incredible images, like, that rocket launcher one. It's like alone worth paying £15 to go to the cinema. If you're not enjoying that, like, what's the point, to be honest? Just so sick. But like, as a set piece, I just find it incoherent. Like, spatially is what I said earlier about like how it feels like you're watching a load of like kids playing paintball. Like, people are just sort of running around. There's no real sense of geography. I don't really know where anyone's going at any point. What I really wish they'd done, maybe Nolan would have definitely thought of this and probably thought it was too obvious, but like, I wish that the climax had been then going back to the opera house. Then it would have fit with the backwards and forwards part of the movie. If they'd somehow staged another set piece at the opera house, I would have preferred that, because I just didn't know what was going on in that final fight. It just felt random.
In my memory, there was a second scene in the opera house. I was surprised to see that that didn't happen.
That battle scene is actually one of my least favorite scenes in the movie. Like Ed and Dylan, first time I thought, I had exactly the same reaction. Like, okay, who are they fighting here? And so as just kind of a visual and auditory feast, if you just like say, okay, I'm just going to watch it for the building, for example. He does so many cool technical things there, but I kind of agree on like the fifth watch of this. It literally is one of my least favorite scenes in the movie, right? I think the truck heist is much better in terms of both advancing the idea of the plot, right? That one, the first time and even like the fifth time, I'm like, ugh, I know this has to be here. And technically it's beautiful and brilliant, and the building and all of that kind of stuff is really great. But I agree, it's a bit of a mess. Like, what the fuck is going on?
Wait, so who were they fighting? This is a question I had, but I didn't bother to actually try.
It was Sator's men, wasn't it?
Sator's men.
Sator's men. Yeah.
Okay.
He just has an army?
Exactly.
He's that kind of villain.
Like, okay.
Well,
all right.
And was it the
standard
Ukrainians?
issue for villains?
Yeah, because the question is, was it the Ukrainians from the beginning? I wasn't quite sure why they were there. I knew it was like a nuclear testing site.
My understanding is that they're burying the algorithm so that people in the future find it.
Exactly.
They have to steal it, but still have the explosion go off so that people think the plan worked and they don't do anything.
Exactly.
But then the algorithm doesn't get to the future. But then you can ask, well, if everything's predetermined and this is happening, maybe it got there anyway and they didn't scatter. But I guess that's the Back to the Future paradox.
Let's just wait and dig it up.
Wait
and dig it up before the future gets there, which should be pretty easy.
That's a lot of work, right? Much easier to do a temporal pincer with armies and reverse bullets.
But Neil.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Can we talk about the Casablanca reference and about how Neil made us cry?
If anyone doesn't like this movie, the whole movie's worth it.
Yeah.
Just for this reference, because I thought
Completely agree.
so
I
beautiful.
completely agree.
So
Yes.
beautiful.
Yeah.
For me, it's the end of a beautiful friendship, but for you, it's just the beginning.
Just beginning.
You have a future in the past. I'll see you at the beginning, my friend. And then he waves and he's just like charming and goes off. Oh, man. Nolan doesn't always do the best endings, but this scene is
I agree.
Yeah.
And then there's kind of like the epilogue and all that. The reveal of the like, I realized I wasn't working for you. We both were working for me.
Yeah.
That's a cool line.
I love how she just rocks up to the assassination at the end as well. Surely she doesn't need to be there. But Priya,
exactly.
She's like, why is she turning up to this random school in like sort of like West London or wherever it is?
She lives in India, but she's gonna fly over and like look at it.
This woman be like gunned down. It's just seems like a risk.
I had exactly the same thought, and I thought it even more strongly. It's like, it gets back to Bond, right? Like, if it were me, I'm the villain. I'm shooting him in the head the minute I see him.
Sator walking away and throwing the lighter on the gas and then not looking at like that's so Bond. I won't even look. I'm so confident you're dead.
And Sator knows that fire doesn't works in reverse too. Like he should.
Exactly.
Maybe he's never done that one. Maybe he's had lasers like freeze people or something, but not car explosions.
So do you like throw ice cubes at someone in order to light them on fire? Like,
That brings up so many questions.
is this the most convoluted reference to Mr. Freeze ever? Or
What if you go up north and like you just like in a bathing suit, like falling in snow, right?
Yeah.
You
burn
have a heat
alive.
stroke.
You burn, you're dead.
Well, this might be kind of lame to bring up, but also when we get to the scene where there's a whole army that's going in reverse, how did they keep this secret at this point? You'd feel like cell phone footage of these guys doing things in reverse and helicopters in reverse and all this stuff would start showing up at some point. Because that's
fake news, fake news.
Yeah, and actually that's the trope there is they have to kill everyone. But I had exactly the same thing. It's like, there's probably satellites that are going to archive all of this data. And somebody is going to go, this is odd. What the fuck?
Yeah. Local police station, right? They're driving backwards again on the highway. We don't know what's going on.
My new headcanon is as this happens in the same universe as Men in Black. And then they send the Men in Black to zap everybody's memories after.
There you go.
One like bigger, like maybe like a wrap up point is I was thinking about it last night and like, unless I've misread it, this movie is like really, really cynical because it's like the future is fucked. The future's going to try and do something about it, but we're like, no, tough. We're going to fuck the future and we're going to look out for our current generation. And they even say like our generations look out for themselves. So there's sort of an inevitability like, yeah, it's all going to go wrong in the future, but like we've just got to look out for ourselves now.
They even mentioned climate change.
Yeah.
They allude to it, yeah, when the rivers run dry. Had he like experimented more with Wheeler's multiverse theory, right? The idea that like if there's a multiverse, in many of those multiverses, things go to shit, right? Mm-hmm. And it would also allow for the unexpected or the, like if we know everything already, if it's predetermined, if it's a deterministic universe that we're living in, that's where the cynicism, I think, Ed, comes in. In a multiverse, like there are 99 times it happens that way, but one time it happens
Avengers
this
Endgame.
way. Yeah.
I got to plug Deadwood. Ed, you reminded me of a line, one of my favorite lines in Deadwood, where like some angry guy is like at the bank trying to attack someone. He's like, "Oh, I'm the institution, I'm the future." And the guy's like, "Fuck the future." And he replies, "Sir, you do not fuck the future fucks you."
Exactly. Well, that is this film in a nutshell. That's great. Yeah.
So I thought we could wrap up with favorite Nolan films and least favorites. We don't have to try to rank them all. That's impossible. But I'm just curious, like around the table, what are your favorites? And then we can just leave it with some parting words. But let's start with Jim.
Well, I'm going to go old school and say the first time I saw Memento, I was like, I really, really want to know more about this guy. In my opinion, it's one of his most perfect, even if smaller. Like the obvious answers are Interstellar and like or Inception or whatever. But Memento for me, actually.
Hell yeah.
Jack, how about you?
I have my ranking. I'll go through it really quick.
You did your homework.
Yep. So this surprised even me, but number one was Oppenheimer. I loved Oppenheimer. Just start to finish, completely, utterly worked for me on every single level without a single scene that I thought was wasted or should be moved or trimmed or edited. Number two, Memento. Jim described it perfectly. Brilliant on every level, like works so good. It's like a Swiss watch of a movie where there's a million moving parts and then they all come together perfectly at the end. Number three is a tie between Batman Begins and Inception. Number four, Dark Knight, which I know most people put above Batman Begins. I think it's a lesser movie, but has a better villain. Number five, The Prestige. Number six, Dunkirk. Number seven, The Dark Knight Rises. Except I also think the opening scene in that is like maybe one of the best scenes in all of Nolan. Number seven, don't throw tomatoes, but Interstellar, a movie I wanted to love so much because I love stuff like that, but this didn't quite land for me. And then number eight, with love, I say Tenet.
Thinking?
In terms of favorite, piggybacking on Jim, Memento, I love so much. And then it's Inception from a narrative chiastic standpoint. The structure is just so beautiful. I can't help but but
Can you explain chiastic?
So like the easiest version of chiasm is never let a kiss fool you and never let a fool kiss you. So kiss and fool invert in an A, B, B prime, A prime pattern. So if you extrapolate that to the structure of an entire narrative, you know, my favorite example is the Odyssey, where Odysseus starts off as this warmongering asshole who allows his men to rape and pillage a village in Act 1, Scene 1. And then at the very end, he's gone through this whole chiastic structure which basically inverts and mirrors itself both structurally and thematically, so that at the very end of the Odyssey, we get Odysseus as this beggar. So he's become humbled and visually ugly and crippled, which is the exact opposite of his warmongering self. You know, I can go very deep into this and talk about this for far longer than we have, but that's a 30-second primer on chiasmus. And Inception has it's a gorgeous example of chiastic structure where you have a dream within a dream within a dream. You know, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you have a letter within a letter within a letter.
Yeah, it's like Wes Anderson, Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yeah. In fact, if you take Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you go to the end of that edition, you take the number of pages, you divide it by 2, and you go to that page, you will find the central chiastic moment where the monster looks in a pool of water and sees himself for the first time. So chiasm is a mirroring, and you get exactly...
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing. Very because cool. I remember when I was reading Mary Shelley and I knew about chiastic structure, I was like, wait a minute, I wonder how on point she got the center. And I literally did that. I went to the end of the book, divided the number of pages by 2, went to that page, and lo and behold, it was right there.
Now I kind of want to do a podcast where you and I just talk about structure and writing.
Oh gosh, yeah, you, me, and Dylan, let's go for sure. But back to Christopher Nolan, those are probably my favorites. I do have to throw some shade because Christopher Nolan does occasionally have some teeth grinding plot holes that really irk me. The best and most obvious one is probably in Batman Begins. And those plot holes have kind of, they didn't set me up well for Tenet, because when I saw it was going to be this convoluted mess, I was like, is it worth the time to analyze all of this just to find that it's just a bowl of spaghetti and not a neat bow tie at the end? Batman.
What's the plot hole? What's the plot hole in Batman Begins?
So the main weapon that Ra's al Ghul, the bad guy, gets a hold of is a microwave emitter that is designed and built by Wayne Enterprises, their defense division. And it's built for the purpose of vaporizing the enemy's water supply. And it's like, oh, well, yeah, that's a great idea, cut off their resources. And then they use this microwave emitter in the last scene. They load it onto the tram, and it's going towards Wayne Enterprises, the central hub of Gotham, where all of the water is routed. And their idea is to vaporize all the water, which has a drug in it, so that everyone gets drugged. And all of the sewer caps are popping off from the steam from the water, which has been vaporized. And I'm sitting there being like, wait a minute, this is a microwave emitter, and humans are 60% plus made of water. Why is Batman not exploding? Why are not all the people who are in the near vicinity of this thing, why are they not popping like roadkill here? This is crazy. So, I could also throw shade on Interstellar, which strangely is a movie I watch all the time because the soundtrack is just mesmerizing, but some of the writing in that movie and the narrative structure boils my blood. But yeah, I don't want to be too negative, but on the whole, I'm so grateful for Nolan. Gosh, Memento, Inception, you throw a dart at his catalog and you're going to hit something great no matter which one you hit. So even though I can find these plot holes, I still love Batman Begins. There's no question.
And when the swings are bigger, the misses are going to be bigger too than if you play it safe. But that's how you get great stuff too.
Oh man. I couldn't agree more with that. I've certainly swung and missed many times, so I can't complain.
Ed, what about you?
Like Jack and Tinker Thinking, I've got Interstellar pretty low down. To be fair, quite a few of Nolan's films I haven't rewatched in a while, so I'd like to rewatch it, but when he takes big emotional swings like that, I just don't think that's his strengths. I don't think the emotional stuff works really in that movie, to be honest. My number one, I'm going a bit more movie bro. Bill Simmons always says, like, on his podcast, he's always like, everyone's favorite film is the film that came out when they were 14. And like, so I was like 14 when Dark Knight came out. It was the first adult film I'd ever like fallen in love with. Like, as a 14-year-old boy, obviously I loved it. I watched it so many times. It just brings me back to like when I first started loving movies. And I actually still think it holds up. I showed it to my wife a couple of years ago and like, it still slaps. It's still sick. And then I was spending so long trying to work out the rest of my rankings, and I ended up with the sort of rotating base of films in second place with Dunkirk, Oppenheimer, Memento, Tenet, and Inception.
That's all second place?
Yeah, all second place. I couldn't pick between them. Like, I think like Oppenheimer is a better movie than Tenet, but sometimes I'd much rather watch Tenet than Oppenheimer. I have a feeling rewatching Dunkirk, it might actually jump like very high up there, because I think like the tension in that film is pretty unbelievable, but I just haven't seen it in a long time.
Well, I was like probably, 12 or 13 when The Dark Knight came out. And I saw it in a little rinky-dink Irish cinema, and it's the only movie I've ever been in Irish cinema and I got a standing ovation. We'd hold those back. We don't give those out easy. You know what I mean?
Was that just for the Cillian Murphy cameo though? Was that just as soon as Cillian Murphy came up, everyone was just going for it?
No, it was at the end, but it was like, it was loud. People were just like gasping and shouting and stuff, and that never happens. Like, you know, Irish are emotionally illiterate oftentimes, and people were like full on just kind of going crazy. So that was like, yeah, that stayed with me. And then I think it all ties back to set and setting too. Like, tinkered that you just weren't in the right frame of mind for Tenet. But I watched Interstellar with my parents, so the emotional stuff just worked very, very well, because it plays right into that. And then Memento, yeah, I think I was like 14, 15, and I had don't even know if I knew who Christopher Nolan was per se, but I just put it on. And I think I watched it back to back, mostly because I didn't get it the first time because I was a little young. But yeah, that stayed with me too. Whereas Inception, I watched it, but it's faded. I haven't felt an impulse to go back. Man,
I was about 14 when The Matrix came out, and that hit like a fucking hydrogen bomb. That was a very influential movie on a young Jack Connor.
The Matrix, I was 39. I still was completely blown away, but I had both of my children, Patrick and Kate, with me. And it was fun for me just to watch them just be like, what the fuck is going on?
That's cool. So Dylan, I think if you had to give your favorite Nolan, do you have a clear favorite, or do you have like, they're all number two, like Ed?
No, Memento's one. But my, like, Interstellar and The Dark Knight would probably be tied to staying power. Dunkirk and Inception would probably be lower down than some of you would like them to be. But they both demand a rewatch as well.
Inception, I thought, stuck the ending pretty well, which Christopher Nolan sometimes struggles with.
Yeah, maybe it was a frame of mind thing, because I can't remember where I was when I watched it, but I can't remember the ending. I can just remember pieces throughout. So I may need to give that one its due.
It's okay. I watched that with my brother recently. I was like all excited to show it to him. My brother's super smart guy. He fucking hated it. Afterwards, he just went off for 30 minutes talking shit about it.
Which one?
Inception.
Really? Oh, brutal.
Art is subjective.
You can be smart and be an idiot at the same time, you know? And art is subjective, yeah.
Isn't that the truth?
Did you say yours, Liberty?
We're the Memento Mafia here. I think Memento would be up there for me. I don't know exactly how to rank them, but my notes say Memento, Prestige, Dunkirk, and Inception.
Nice.
I'm surprised no one said The Prestige. Well, you're the first person. I know a couple people that say Prestige is his best movie. I've heard this argument many times.
For a while, I would have ranked it number one, yeah. I haven't rewatched it in a year, so maybe could go up or down the ranking when I rewatched it. But for a few years after watching it, it was like my favorite film.
I think it depends if you buy into the ending or not.
I like the ending. I buy into it.
So let's bring this home. Thank you so much for doing this. It's a bit bonkers, I think, to have so many people talk about such a confusing film, but I think we did pretty well. And now we have to go in the turnstile, reverse, and go back to the intro, do it all again. But no, seriously, any parting words? Just thoughts about the film, about Nolan, about any of this? Let's start with Ed.
I suppose the best parting words is to look forward and say, have you guys seen that? So like his next film is going to be Matt Damon and Tom Holland, the Spider-Man guy. And then there's two rumors. One rumor is that it's going to be like a horror film. And then one rumor is going to be a sort of inspired by a version of some 80s action helicopter film that I'd never heard of. That sounds like almost like a sub Top Gun. I don't know, but either sound pretty sweet.
Iron Wolf?
Potentially, yeah. I'd rather see him try and make another film like Tenet than another film like Oppenheimer. I like fun Nolan more than serious Nolan, I think. But Tenet's great. Everyone should watch Tenet.
Dylan?
Yeah. Again, the fact that I put it off, and I probably would have continued to put it off just because it's so polarizing. But I think it's, even if you are putting it off, I think it's definitely worth it. It's kind of like if Memento, Interstellar, and Inception had a child who happened to be its own mother in a kind of twisted way. I saw a YouTube comment. It was like Inception, time goes slow, Interstellar, time go fast, and Tenet, time go burr. As well, which I think was kind of perfect. But if a director takes a swing, especially nowadays, you'll get away with so many plot holes and problems if you're just really trying for something unique. And he does. Just appreciating that. And even if you tune out of the plot, I had the virtue of being able to pause it. I'd imagine when the cinema releases, there's a lot of people who went to it unsuspecting, and they're like, they didn't have a chance to catch their breath. So
without subtitles and with the big sound muffling everything, it's harder to follow.
Yeah, so that's tricky. But yeah, I liked it and I'd recommend it. And I wasn't sure that I would.
Very quickly, Blue Thunder was the helicopter film. I haven't seen it, or I hadn't even heard of it before I read that.
That's such an 80s film title.
Yeah.
Jack, how about you?
Ed, I saw that rumor and it made me so happy that his work is so under wraps that the two speculations for what this movie, the biggest movie stars in the world, are like as far apart as you can possibly imagine. You know, a period piece about vampires or a futuristic movie about helicopters. One or the other.
Maybe he'll combine them. No, that would be sick. A vampire film set on helicopters.
Well, that would have to have time travel.
Yeah, he probably planted those rumors. I know that the Batman Begins had like a completely off tangent title for like the longest time when the script was getting worked on. I can't remember what it was, but it was like completely unrelated.
After Oppenheimer, which, you know, made $1 billion, was one of the best performing movies of the last decade. And for being a movie that, you know, in the age when like Avengers gets a $300 million budget, and he makes that for $100 million, and it's just actors and everything like that. He has a blank check to do whatever he wants from this point forward. He will. It's like the Wachowskis. How, you know, the Wachowskis have made a lot of questionable movies recently. I tend to love them, but they're interesting, and they're not. I don't know if great, but it's like The Matrix was so successful that they'll be able to just get people to fund whatever they want until like the heat death of the universe, essentially.
M. Night Shyamalan seems to have some of that store credit too, where you can just keep pumping them out.
Right.
Thinking? Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I just really appreciate an excuse to dive back into this movie. Because like I said, when I first watched it, I was like, this is narrative. This is narrative word salad. And I just don't want to go down this rabbit hole. But I found like, even with subjects that you don't like, if you persist with your attention, you can find something to love no matter what. I think it's a skill more than anything. So it was definitely an opportunity to, you know, make that possibility shine. So it's really nice to arrive at this point and be like, you know what? There's actually a ton that I really appreciate about this film. And then being able to talk about it with you guys is pretty awesome. So thank you, Liberty, and thank everyone here. It's pretty dope.
Yeah, Liberty, thank you, man. What's the next one? You got to think about that. I would do this again.
So many options. It's a high quality problem of having to choose one, but yeah, let's do this again. And I have to mention, in case I edited out earlier, but Jim had to leave a bit early. But thank you all for joining. This was great. Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.